Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 64 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Lane Hendricks for this episode, and it was great to have her back on the show after our initial discussion, which was way back in episode 11. And Lane is at Kate's Club in Atlanta, Georgia. And I also had the pleasure of meeting her in person last year at the National Alliance for Grieving Children Symposium in Utah, which was last June. So it was terrific to have her back on the show today. The topic today is based on questions that I've gotten from listeners who are widowed parents of infants and very young children. And I knew that Lane would be just the right person to talk with about this, given both her own experience as a widowed parent, her girls, one was 3 years old and one was an infant when her husband died, and her kids are now young adults, and also her professional experience at Kate's Club working with families with kids in all different age groups, including young children. I should say before we get started here that we definitely had some issues with sound quality. We recorded this just last week during the global pandemic here, when so many people seem to be working from home and doing school online from home, and the internet seems to be overloaded. And I actually, at one point, we lost the call altogether. I was able to get Lane back on the line, fortunately, and we continued the discussion. But from that point on, it was a little bit difficult to hear her. I left the discussion in because I think she had some really terrific things to say, and I hope you'll stick with the scratchiness in the latter part of the show. I think we could have kept talking a lot longer, but I didn't want to make you guys listen to the scratchiness for too terribly long, but I appreciate you putting up with it for a short time here. And it was so great that Lane was able to come on and we made it work at all. Some of you might know that we've had trouble scheduling this. We were all set to do this a few weeks before, and then my microphone just kind of stopped working, and we had to redo this this week. So anyway, here we are. Some of the things that we talked about some of the main issues or challenges that can come up when people find themselves a widowed parent of a very young child. We talked about the fact that an infant needs someone to consistently meet their needs in order to develop a secure attachment, and how important that secure attachment is. We talked about different things that might unfold over time as the child grows, which may be a different experience from, a child who loses a parent, maybe in, middle childhood or teenage years. Not that one is necessarily easier, harder, better, worse, any of that kind of stuff, just that there's different things to maybe be thinking about, or different things that might come up as issues over time. And we talked especially about Lane's basketball analogy about the resiliency of kids. And she talks about this right at the very end, and it's when the discussion gets a little, or the sound gets a little scratchy. If you can't quite hear it, I think you can hear it, but if you want to hear her talk about it in a little more depth, if you go back to episode 11, our first discussion, she talks about it there as well. So anyway, with that, here's our discussion, and I hope you enjoy my discussion with Lane Hendricks. My guest today is Lane Hendricks, who is the program director at Kate's Club in Atlanta, Georgia. And if this sounds familiar, it may be because I interviewed Lane, who was then known as Lane Pease, way back in episode 11. So Lane, congratulations on your recent marriage, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really been looking forward to speaking with you today. And I should say first that I actually recently re-listened to our first discussion in preparation for our discussion today. And it was just as informative and insightful as I remember. So I want to thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes for sure, because it is one of the episodes that I send out actually when new listeners join my email list, and I send out a few emails like, here are some suggestions for getting started. It's one of the ones I include in there because I do think it's a really important discussion. It hits a lot of the key considerations and points I think that parents might want to be aware of or be thinking about or considering So thank you again for that. And also, anybody who is in Atlanta or in that area for sure should listen to hear about your programming as well, because I think it's a terrific resource you guys have there at Kate's Club.
Thank you. Yeah, you're so welcome. I enjoyed doing that, and I got a lot of positive feedback on it from people locally. Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Good. Okay, so let's tee up today's topic here. I've gotten a number of questions from widowed parents, both moms and dads, who have very young kids. Maybe they have an infant. Maybe in some cases the child was even born after, if the dad died while the mom was pregnant. Maybe they never even met their dad, or maybe it's a widowed dad now who all of a sudden has an infant because the mom died very early on. So I wanted to talk with you about this today specifically. It's a topic we haven't covered yet, and I think lately we've been doing more focused on older kids and teenagers, so I think it's good to come back and make sure we're covering all age groups here. So, and I know we talked about your story and your journey in the first discussion, so we won't have to go back through that here. Again, encourage listeners to listen to that. But can you just remind us how old your kids were when your husband died?
Yes. So my daughters were, one was 4 years old, and the other was 9 months old. So my husband was diagnosed with cancer when I was pregnant with our second child. And so, yes, he died when she was 9 months old.
Yeah. Okay. And both of your kids are young adults now, I believe?
Yes. I can't believe so much time has passed, but one is 20 and one is 24.
Yeah. Terrific. Okay. And also, of course, in your position at Kate's Club, you have extensive experience with families who have kids of every different age, including, of course, this younger age group. So good. Okay. So I've been looking forward to this discussion. So let's just jump right in here. What do you think are some of maybe the main issues or challenges when people come to you and they're now all of a sudden a widowed solo parent with an infant or a very young child? What are some of the main issues you think that you're seeing in these cases?
I think like with any age it's overwhelming, but the physical nature of caring for an infant, the sleep deprivation, all those things are just compounded. So your kids are not at all independent to play on their own or to do anything on their own. So when you become a new mother or a new father, it's overwhelming anyway. So when you add in that, I like to give the example sometimes that in my case, in my family, we went from one child with two parents in a matter of really months to being one parent with two children.
And that's a huge difference.
Right. So that was, so I think the over amount of just the taxing on us physically and then emotionally. So you're trying to grieve or you need to grieve, but most people in that situation, in a way, they have to put it off. Because you are up the next day or in the middle of the night and you're just constantly on go. So I think that's a big challenge is just the such amount of work it is to parent an infant and then to lose your partner.
And there's really if you have to go to the store or whatever, there's no leave the kids home and even go for a short walk or anything. It's you're either taking them or you're getting someone to watch them, but you're always on.
Exactly. I felt I couldn't go to the gas station or the drugstore by myself unless someone like my parents were there visiting to care for the children, that I couldn't go by myself for
years,
years and years. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So also in terms of the kind of the immediate short-term stuff, I guess, and I'm thinking about the infant themselves, do you have any thoughts on how much what does their grief look like? Do they grieve? Do they understand? Do they not understand? What do they understand? Or what does it look like? An infant is not going to say to you, Mommy, I miss Daddy. Right. So I guess what does that maybe look like instead?
It's really that familiarity that's gone. So the infant can feel anxiety. especially if the person was their primary caregiver, was the person with them the most. They can long for the smells of that person, the touch of that person. So like anytime you see an infant have separation anxiety from their caregiver, then you can expect that separation anxiety. So they will feel that. They may regress if they're older, getting into the toddler years, of course, they could regress from, even if they're learning a new skill, they could take a step back. So infants feel a longing. If you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve, but it's not going to look the same as it does in an older child, right? So the best to do is keep that routine as much as possible, and they need that attachment. So they need to securely attach to someone, and usually that's the parent that remains.
Okay, let's explore that a little more, this topic of attachment, because that feels like it would be very important here. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, secure attachment is, when the infant knows that somebody's going to meet their needs, and not just in a physical sense of just caring for the physical needs, but those cuddles, those the laughing, the play, everything that goes into, when you're interacting with an infant. So having a person that's consistently there is really important. What happens sometimes if a parent is overwhelmed with grief, they may be able to meet that infant's needs. But and if they can't, they can't. But the infant needs someone else, whether that's grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle, to meet those needs and be warmly and securely attached to. There's a lot more to parenting an infant, as we all know, than just meeting their physical needs.
Okay, that makes sense. So it sounds like it's important then for that surviving parent to kind of maybe recognize if they are struggling to the degree where they're having trouble with that. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Providing kind of that secure attachment, or really being that primary, that somebody needs to do that. And if they need to pull in a relative or somebody to really be some stability and warmth and responsiveness, if they're significantly struggling, that they need to make sure they're doing that.
Yes, I would say that. And not even, I would also say, if they're still able to meet those needs, that's great. But then we go into, what do the parents need? And I'm sure we're probably going to talk about that in a moment, but that's when you can ask for help, and you should ask for help.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that then. Yeah. So what does that look like?
It really looks like on calling on your village, because physically, emotionally, mentally, it's very hard to do everything yourself. And then you throw in the grief component. So I think calling on family members. I have something I tell Kate's Club moms and dads all the time, and grandmas, that if someone asks if they can help and they do not mean it, when you take them up on it, they won't ask again. Right? So if they say, maybe they want to take an older child after school, and they say, oh, if I can do that, let me know. And if you say, yes, you can do that, and they really didn't want to, they won't ask you again. So that's kind of how you sift out those people who are sincere and those people who just want to say, if there's anything I can do, let me know. If you let them know what they can do, and they either make excuses or they do it, but they don't want to, they won't offer again. And those people who sincerely want to help will help. And I think it's really nice for children, young children and infants, to know that there's other people that they can count on. So in my case, my sister and my parents and my brother-in-law were people that they saw very frequently and felt very safe and secure with. So, until this day, they're close to my sister. My parents have since passed away, but my sister and my brother-in-law. So there's nothing wrong with kids knowing that there's more than just mom or just dad that's going to love and care for them. Actually, it's essential. It's really important for them to know that. So I think we have to sometimes step back and say we need help, and ask for help. And that help may be with the child, or it may be doing some other, like going to get groceries or this or that. Sometimes, though, when we're parenting an infant, we need to have some moments to ourselves. And what's not happening when you're a widowed parent is that person at least coming home at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening to take over for a while. I think that's really hard. Those nights are extremely hard.
Okay. So I'm also thinking about challenges as they might unfold over time. And I'm thinking that, it may be a different, I'm not saying easier or harder or better or worse, just a different experience. Somebody who has children who lost their parent very young, then as they go through those different developmental milestones, or as childhood moves on, I guess what should parents maybe be thinking about in terms of challenges that might unfold over time?
Right. Well, I think there's a lack of awareness that children grieve what they never had, that they can grieve what they never had or what they don't remember. So a few years ago, when my youngest daughter, who was the one that was 9 months old when her father died, she had a drama monologue to do, and it had to be something from their own life. And I happened to find it typed out. And you have to know about my daughter, she's very open about her journey and very just willing to help others. And I read it and I said, would you mind if I shared this? So I actually shared it as a blog for Kate's Club.
And she was in high school at this point?
She was in high school. I think she was a junior or a junior. And she said, in the monologue, she said, when I tell people how young I was when my father died, they really think it was no big deal. They don't have memory. And then she went on to say, but I think of him every day. And I miss him every day, and I want to make him proud. So I think that kind of sums it up, is we do miss what we never knew. And there's a whole thing, a different component to it. So how do you grieve that? And children will grieve longer for early loss because they have more time. So each developmental stage, they recognize it in a new way. My daughters told me, even my one that was 4, when her dad died, that they really didn't recognize the loss so much as when they went to school and they saw other people as they got older into elementary school, and they saw other people with their fathers, and they started going for play dates and seeing that missing piece in their own life. So I think it's just essential that we recognize, even if mom was pregnant when dad died, or mom died in childbirth, that person will always grieve that person. That child will always grieve. And remarriage, even when they're young and they have a great loving step parent who maybe becomes their parent, there's still a longing and a missing to know who that person was. My daughter told me one day, she said, Mom, don't you think it's weird? I don't know my dad. She said, I know you. I know who you are, how you act, but I don't know him. As much as I've told him stories, as much as his family told her stories, there is just a missing piece and a longing for that person that I think with just recognizing it and talking about it can make that a lot better.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Such an important point. And I imagine that could be complicated by maybe not having pictures with that deceased parent, or maybe the only picture you have is when you're 9 months old, or and now you're 20, and you don't have a more recent picture, of the two of you together to keep in front of you or something.
Right. When I pull out pictures for my daughters, my youngest only has pictures of her dad when he was going through cancer treatment, and only has him up to 9 months. So I know that's something that there's such a finite amount of pictures as well. So I also wanted to talk a little about how, if you have different age children and you have older children that are going to have more memories and a different relationship with the parent than the infant, how that younger child can really become jealous sometimes and really envy that relationship that the older child was able to have. So that's something important to recognize, that if you see some resentment of that, especially when the person is brought up, when we're talking about the person who died, that younger child can have some jealousy.
I've heard that, actually. That's such a good point. Sometimes a parent will say that the youngest sibling will express frustration. Everybody around me seems to have memories of this person and I don't.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Can we talk a little bit about this notion of getting support for kids and maybe what that looks like over time? I mean, if a parent dies and a kid is in grade school or middle school, maybe they're going to go to Camp Aaron right away, or go to a program at Kate's Club right away, or whatever, sometime in the, fairly soon. But, an infant isn't going to Camp Aaron. So is that something you maybe would consider then many years down the road? Or, is it, I guess, what does support look like, or what are some of the considerations around that if you have a child who's lost a parent so young that they're not doing something maybe right away, but then what maybe should you be thinking about over time?
Well, I think sometimes the child leads with more questions or even more behaviors when they're older, when they're starting to realize, as my children did, that what was missing. And so you can reach out for support. But I think it's important to reach out support for them and recognize that, again, they are grieving. So we have children come into Kate's Club when they're 5, when they're old enough to join, who maybe lost a dad when mom was pregnant. Now their grief does look different. And so what we try to do at Kate's Club is really have those discussions of what is it like not to have memories, and what are some things you wish you could have done. So on those, not every month at Kate's Club is focused on memories, which is good, but it's also talking about, when we do talk about those memories, what are memories you wish you could have made? And how does it feel when you don't have those memories? So I think it's really important for any grief or bereavement organizations that deal with children is to think about that. So how does that look for children who were very, very young when the person died? So yeah, just to keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And that's something I guess I'm so keenly aware of since it was my own circumstance. Yeah. And so my older daughter went to a camp, a bereavement camp. I guess when she was old enough, it started at 7, and she was 4, almost 5 when her dad died. So she went at 7, and she immediately, actually, right after she turned 5, did some grief support things that were around in our community at the time. And it happened to be interning for my degree in counseling at a hospice that put on a bereavement camp. My older daughter had been to at the time. My youngest was about 10 or 11, and the social worker there said, Lucy could come to camp. And I was like, oh, she could. And in her monologue, I was going back to that, she had mentioned, well, I don't feel that when she went to that camp, she didn't feel worthy really of being there, because all these kids had such recent losses and they had known their parent. But she said, after being there that weekend, she realized she had just as much right to be there. And she was grieving. So that's been really interesting. And I picked my daughter's brains recently because I'm doing some research about grief over the lifespan. So how does early loss affect us all throughout our life? So they're kind of young adults, but also I just want to go up to people of all ages. But some of the things they shared were really eye-opening even to me, that I didn't know they were going through at the time.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, that is one of the reasons why I think it's so important. Some of the interviews that I've been able to do with people who are now adults who lost a parent when they were young, it is really eye-opening to me as a parent. I lost a spouse, but I didn't lose a parent, so it's a different experience. And to hear from them and hear their journeys and their reflections and what they struggled with that was maybe unexpected or expected or whatever, I do think it's really important for those of us who are widowed parents to try to take some time to try to, I don't know, gain some of that perspective where we can. Let's go back now to maybe back up to the early years. There, maybe it's right after the person died or in those first months and years, depending on the, I guess, verbal ability of the child, however old they are. I'm thinking about, how do you start having these conversations about that parent who died, or about the fact that they died, or I'm just thinking about how do you have these conversations, and language you use and how you describe this as you help them understand, the situation as they grow here.
I think that's one of the most difficult parts of this, because we know children don't really realize what death is and the finality of death till, even 7 years old sometimes. So how do you kind of convey that to a child, infant, toddler, or I'm not sure I have the perfect answer. Kind of what happened in my family is that we had pictures everywhere, and my older daughter would talk about Daddy, and I would talk about him. And I just taught Lucy, my youngest, that your daddy died. And so she knew those words before I think she knew kind of what that meant. So one time in the grocery store, very interesting, fun.
Okay, we're back here. I should say we're actually recording here on March 26th, and we are in the middle of this global pandemic when everybody seems to be working from home and using Zoom. So we have a little instability in the connection. Right before we dropped there, Lane, I think you were going to start to tell us about a story in the grocery store. Your daughter brought up something.
Yeah, so I think my daughter, who was 9 months when her dad died, Lucy, she was about 3, and we were in the grocery store checking out. And I remember what I had bought that day, but the clerk, well-meaning, as she was, but we know about well-meaning people sometimes, said, "Oh, are you cooking for your daddy to?" And I looked at her straight in the eye and said, "My daddy died." And the clerk had this mortified look and just stunned. And I got it and said, mm-hmm. And so she had these words about dying or death, or her daddy died, before she really understood the concept. So the concept probably came later, as she was 4, 5, 6, what that really meant. And then as she got older, of course, even more explanation of he was sick and what happened and that kind of thing.
It's almost reminded me of the approach. So we adopted both of our kids, and the advice we got was, and they were both infants. It's not something that you sit down sometime later and have one big talk. Let me tell you something, you were adopted. It's more like you start the discussion very early, using the words where they don't maybe fully understand, but they just kind of gradually come to understand it as part of their world, as opposed to being like some big thing that you tell them later in some big conversation.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful explanation. So you can, in a discussion, you have all the way along, and you give them more information as they want it. School-age children tend to want a lot of details. So they may hit that age, and even in the cases of more traumatic deaths like suicide or homicide, they may want more information about what happened. So it's not a one and done situation at all. It's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, terrific. Okay. I think we're starting to have more and more difficulty with the connection here, and I want to save listeners from having to listen to something that's potentially becomes garbled. So why don't we go ahead and wrap it up soon here? Are there maybe any couple of key points that we haven't covered yet that you want to make sure we talk about?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that children are resilient automatically. So even when talking about children who lose a parent at a young age, especially at a young age, they're more apt to say, oh, they're resilient. They'll bounce right back. But my analogy about resilience is children are not little bouncy balls that automatically bounce back from anything. And they're not also medicine balls, that when you're working out, you have to go way back to the ground to pick up because they're so heavy. They're like a basketball. They can bounce back, but they need someone to bounce them. They need someone to help them with that resiliency. So I think really building your village, building that network around you, because we know that another trusted adult in their life helps build resilience. So think of it in terms of who is your village and relying on that village.
Terrific. I'm so glad you shared that analogy with us again. I loved that the first time when we talked back in episode 11, and I'm so glad you shared it again because I think it's such a good analogy. So thank you for talking about that. So you know what? I think this is actually a great place to end. I hope that listeners are able to hear most of our discussion because I think it was such a good discussion on such an important topic here today. And I appreciate you coming back to talk with us. So my guest today is Lane Hendricks, who is the program director at Kate's Club in Atlanta. So Lane, where can listeners find Kate's Club if they are in your area and would like to connect with you guys?
Yeah, so go to www.katesclub.org, all one word, Kate, starting with a K, and you should have all our information on our website of how to join. We're pretty centrally located right in Atlanta.
Okay, terrific. Well, Lane, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Lane Hendricks as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 64. And this week, a big shout out to listeners who are in New York. I'm thinking of you guys right now. As I'm recording this, it's March 31st, and you seem to be in the epicenter for the moment of one of the hardest hit places with the coronavirus, at least in terms of here in the U.S. So I'm thinking about you guys. You may know that I lived in New York for a while, shortly after my husband and I got married. About 6 months later, we moved to New York for a big adventure, and we were there for about 5 years. So I have been following that, listening to your governor, and wishing you guys there all the best. And for everyone out there, I hope you're managing well enough right now. I posted on social media this week that I've abandoned my alarm clock, and I'm working on erasing sleep debt. And I know that not everybody can do this right now. There are so many different situations with, whether people have to work, don't have to work, can't work, have to work from home, are going into the front lines in the grocery stores and the hospitals. Many, many different situations, different amounts of homeschooling going on, all kinds of things. But I feel like for myself that trying to squeeze in some extra sleep is a kind of a protective health measure that I can actually take right now. So whether it's trying to squeeze in a nap, whether it's trying to make bedtime a little earlier or wake up time a little later, I hope you can find a way to at least try to get a little bit of extra sleep as a way to try to, for all of us, to try to maintain our health these days. Speaking of the pandemic, I hope you've been able to listen to some of the pandemic special episodes that I've been putting out every few days. If you have younger kids or grade school age kids, do see the episode I put out just a couple of days ago from the authors of it. It's a brand new free ebook. It's called I Have a Question About Coronavirus. And I actually interviewed these authors, Arlen Gaines and Meredith Polsky, last summer, and they have a couple other books. I have a question about death, and I have a question about cancer, books for kids, terrific books. And they put together this brand new one about coronavirus and made it free on their website. So I encourage you to download that and have a listen to that episode. It's number 63. And if you have older teens or young adults, a few days back, I think it was late last week, probably episode 62, a terrific discussion with Julie Lithcott-Hames about parenting when you have those older kids and young adults. So do check that one out too. And I don't know what's coming next. I'm working on identifying some additional topics and additional guests for more short episodes. So stay tuned on social media and of course here and in the emails. By the way, if you're not on my email list, please do go over to my website. It's jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK. And you can make sure you're on my list so you don't miss any episodes coming up. All right, hey, I think that's all for today. So thank you for listening, and until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.